Remember when dinner meant more than just ordering takeout? Back when ground beef wasn't just a quick fix, but the star of meals that brought families running to the table? Those recipes, the ones that could turn a simple pound of beef into pure magic, they've slowly disappeared from our kitchens. But today, we're bringing back these forgotten treasures. 25 ground beef recipes that vanished from family tables, each with a story worth telling. These aren't just meals, they're pieces of our history that deserve another chance to shine. Allow me to let you in on these forgotten kitchen secrets. Hobo dinner packets. Back in the 1930s, when every penny counted, folks found clever ways to turn simple ingredients into something special. That's when Hobo dinner packets made their mark on American tables. Picture this, a perfectly seasoned patty of ground beef, tucked into foil with carrots, potatoes, and onions. These packets got their start along the railroad tracks where workers needed meals they could cook right over their campfires. The foil packet wasn't just clever packaging, it was their secret weapon for turning tough cuts of beef into tender, flavorful meals. These railway workers discovered something amazing. When you wrap everything together, those vegetables release their natural juices, making the beef more tender than you'd ever imagine. And here's a secret most folks don't know. They'd add a pat of butter and a sprinkle of dried thyme right before sealing the packet. That butter would slowly melt, creating a sauce that's pure heaven. You know what's funny? While these packets started as a necessity, they became a favorite at backyard cookouts and camping trips. They were simple, sure, but they had something most modern meals don't. That magical moment when you unwrap the foil and get hit with a cloud of savory steam that tells you dinner's about to be amazing. Speaking of amazing transformations, wait until you hear about another forgotten favorite that turned humble ingredients into something special. Swedish potato beef casserole. Long before fancy casseroles took over American kitchens, Swedish immigrants brought something special to our dinner tables. The Swedish potato beef casserole wasn't just another dish. It was a masterpiece of layering that could make a modest amount of ground beef taste like a feast fit for royalty. The magic? It started with paper-thin sliced potatoes, each layer brushed with a velvety white sauce that would make your grandmother weak in the knees. This wasn't your regular cream sauce. No, this had a touch of nutmeg and white pepper, secrets that crossed the Atlantic with those first Swedish families who settled in Minnesota. But here's what made it truly special, the way those potatoes were layered. So each slice had to overlap just right, creating a pattern that wasn't just pretty, it was practical. When the beef mixture hit those perfectly arranged potatoes, something magical happened in the oven. The juices would seep down, creating pockets of flavor that had everyone at the holiday table asking for the recipe. Now let's head down to Ohio, where another immigrant family was stirring up something extraordinary. Cincinnati-style chili mac. Cincinnati-style chili mac isn't your regular chili, not even close. Imagine ground beef simmered in a sauce that'll make your taste buds dance. We're talking cinnamon, chocolate, and a blend of spices that would make most chili cook-off champions scratch their heads in wonder. This wasn't just some random creation. Those Greek restaurant owners took their knowledge of Mediterranean spices and mixed it with American comfort food. The result? A five-way sensation that had people lining up around the block. You started with a bed of spaghetti, added that spiced beef, then came the beans, onions, and a mountain of finely shredded cheese. But here's something most folks don't know. The original recipe included a splash of red wine vinegar. It cut through the richness and made all those exotic spices sing. Each neighborhood joint had its own secret ratio of spices, and let me tell you, those recipes were guarded better than bank vaults. Next up, a recipe that proves sometimes the simplest dishes hold the biggest surprises. Depression-era meatloaf, Wellington. Who says tough times can't inspire creativity? During the Great Depression, clever home cooks transformed the fancy beef Wellington into something remarkable. The Depression-era meatloaf Wellington. This wasn't just making do, it was making magic. Instead of expensive cuts, they used seasoned ground beef. The real genius that golden pastry wrapped around it. Home cooks discovered that a simple mixture of flour, water, and whatever fat they had on hand could create layers almost as flaky as the original puff pastry. They'd roll it paper thin, fold it just so, and achieve that golden exterior that made everyone forget about hard times, at least for one meal. The presentation made it special too. Each loaf came to the table with a pattern scored on top, maybe a wheat sheaf design or simple crosshatches. These weren't just decorations, they were stamps of pride that turned Sunday dinner into an occasion. And speaking of special occasions, let's talk about a dish that brought families together in a different way. Ground beef radio dinner. Picture this. It's the 1930s. The radio's playing your favorite evening program, and dinner's cooking in one trusty skillet. This wasn't just any meal. It was timed perfectly to be ready during the evening radio shows. Families would gather around, plates in hand, listening to their programs while enjoying this clever creation. The beauty was in its timing. You'd start browning the beef just as Amos and Andy began. Add the vegetables when Jack Benny cracked his first joke. And by the time your favorite mystery show reached its climax, dinner was ready to serve. Every step was measured not by minutes, but by radio segments. Just around the corner, another forgotten recipe was making waves in American kitchens. Beef and cornmeal tamale pie. Down along the southwest border, something wonderful was happening in American kitchens. The beef and cornmeal tamale pie took the best of Mexican tradition and mixed it with Depression-era ingenuity. This wasn't your regular casserole. This was borderland magic at its finest. The secret lay in that cornmeal crust. Unlike today's quick mix versions, these home cooks knew something special. They'd toast the cornmeal first, stirring it slowly in a dry skillet until it released an aroma that could make your mouth water from 3 houses away. Then they'd mix it with hot water, just like their Mexican neighbors taught them, creating a base that was crispy on the outside, tender inside. The filling? Ground beef seasoned with chilies, garlic, and a pinch of cumin, spices that were starting to find their way into American pantries. But here's the clever part. They'd mix in whatever vegetables the garden offered, stretching that precious beef further than you'd think possible. When times got really tough, this dish could feed twice as many mouths as a regular meal, and nobody left the table hungry. Let's fast forward to the post-war years, when American kitchens were buzzing with a different kind of creativity. Sunday night hash soufflé. The Sunday night hash soufflé might sound fancy, but it was born from pure practicality. After Sunday's big family dinner, clever cooks would transform leftover roast beef by grinding it fresh, mixing it with yesterday's potatoes, and working pure kitchen magic. The real trick wasn't in the ingredients, it was all in the technique. They'd fold in whipped egg whites, just like the French taught us, but with a practical American twist. Every family had their own method. Some swore by beating the eggs with a fork exactly 100 times, while others had special copper bowls passed down through generations, reserved just for this purpose. When that soufflé came out of the oven, puffed up, proud and golden, it didn't matter that it started as leftovers. It was a brand new dish that had everyone at the table sitting up a little straighter. Somehow it made Sunday night feel just as special as Sunday afternoon. As American kitchens evolved, another clever dish was making its mark on family tables. Pioneer trail mix meatballs. Those wagon trains heading west carried more than just dreams. They carried cooking wisdom that would change American food forever. Pioneer trail mix meatballs were born on those dusty trails where every ingredient had to earn its place in the wagon. These weren't your ordinary meatballs. Pioneer women mixed ground beef with dried fruits they'd packed for the journey. Raisins, dried apples, even dried berries. The fruit didn't just add sweetness, it kept the meat moist during long hours of cooking over open fires. They'd roll these meatballs in crushed, dried corn, creating a protective outer layer that helped them stay fresh longer. Those cast-iron Dutch ovens weren't just cooking pots. They were survival tools. Nestled in hot coals, they turned these fruited meatballs into something that could keep a family going through days of hard traveling. The real trick: they'd save the cooking liquid, letting it cool into a gel that preserved the leftover meatballs for the next day's journey. Look at these original trail cooking tools. Each dent and scratch tells a story of survival and innovation. You won't believe how they used these to prepare our next forgotten recipe: Victory Garden Beef Pie. When World War II struck American soil, those pioneer lessons about stretching ingredients found new life in Victory Garden Beef Pie. This wasn't just dinner, it was doing your part for the war effort. Every backyard garden became a tiny battlefield against waste and want. Home cooks mixed ground beef with whatever their Victory gardens produced: carrots, peas, potatoes, turning a single pound of rationed meat into a feast. The crust wasn't your regular pastry. They'd mix it with mashed turnips or parsnips, adding nutrition while saving precious flour for the troops. The clever part? Neighborhoods would coordinate their garden planting. One family grew tomatoes, another raised beans, and come harvest time, they'd share so everyone could make these pies with different vegetables. It wasn't just about feeding families, it was about keeping communities strong. While wartime brought out American ingenuity in the kitchen, another recipe was simmering its way into history: railway station beef turnovers. Back when trains ruled American travel, railway station kitchens served up something remarkable: beef turnovers that could keep passengers satisfied for miles. These weren't your regular ham pies, they were little miracles wrapped in pastry. The crust was special, so flaky it would shatter like glass, but sturdy enough to survive a journey. Station cooks had a secret. They'd fold butter into the dough 13 times, creating layers so delicate they'd melt on your tongue. The filling: seasoned ground beef mixed with diced potatoes and onions, all chopped fine enough to spread the flavors through every bite. Those station cooks could spot a train's whistle from miles away. By the time it pulled into the station, they'd have these turnovers piping hot, wrapped in wax paper, ready to warm the hands and hearts of weary travelers. Each station had its own twist, maybe a pinch of sage in Minnesota, or a dash of paprika down in St. Louis. But when the Great Depression hit, American kitchens had to learn new tricks. That's when Depression stretcher patties appeared on dinner tables across the country. Depression stretcher patties. These weren't just ordinary patties. They were a testament to American creativity when times got tough. Home cooks discovered that mixing cooked rice right into the ground beef didn't just make it last longer, it made it better. The rice would soak up all those meat juices, creating a patty that was somehow more flavorful than pure beef. The technique was genius in its simplicity. They'd mix 1 part ground beef with 2 parts cooked rice, add a splash of milk to keep things moist, and season it with whatever they had on hand. Some folks added grated carrots or onions, making the meat stretch even further. The real secret? Pressing each patty thin and cooking it until the edges got crispy. Those edges became the best part of the meal. While some cooks were mastering the art of stretching ingredients, others were revolutionizing lunchtime. Lunch counter beef scramble. Those chrome-plated diners that dotted American highways had a secret weapon. The lunch counter beef scramble. This wasn't just quick cooking. It was an art form performed on a sizzling griddle right before your eyes. Short-order cooks knew exactly where the hot spots were on their well-seasoned griddles. They'd drop the ground beef right on that sweet spot, breaking it up with those signature metal spatulas that sang against the cooking surface. The trick? They never stopped moving that beef around. The constant motion created little crispy bits that made every bite special. These cooks had their own language too. Paint it red meant add tomato sauce, give it a blanket called for melted cheese, and make it cry meant pile on the onions. Each diner had its own special seasoning mix, stored in old coffee cans with holes punched in the lids, ready to shower that sizzling beef with flavor. Now for something that brought entire communities together: church supper beef squares. Church basement kitchens had these enormous pans, big enough to feed half the congregation. The women who ran these kitchens knew exactly how to layer ground beef, cheese, and their special sauce to make sure every square came out perfect. They'd mark the casseroles with tiny toothpick flags, creating a grid so each serving was exactly the same size. Nobody went home hungry, and nobody got more than their fair share. The real magic happened when all those casseroles were baking. They'd time it just right so the aroma would drift up into the sanctuary just as service was ending. Some folks swear they could tell which ladies were cooking that night just by the smell. Mrs. Johnson always added extra oregano, while Mrs. Miller's secret weapon was a dash of celery salt. Speaking of feeding crowds, the factory workers' beef roll changed the game for America's industrial workforce. Factory workers' beef roll. These weren't your delicate lunch sandwiches. These rolls were built to fuel the men and women running America's factories. The dough was sturdy, enriched with eggs and milk to keep it soft even after hours in a lunch pail. Inside, seasoned ground beef was mixed with rice and chopped vegetables, then rolled up tight like a jelly roll. The genius was in how they baked them, slow and low until the outside got a crust that would protect everything inside. Factory workers could slice off what they needed during their short lunch breaks, and the rest stayed fresh for later. Some clever cooks would hide surprises inside, maybe a line of cheese or pickles running through the middle, giving their hard-working family members something to look forward to during those long shifts. As factory whistles gave way to office buzzers, American cooking kept evolving. Boarding house special. In those old city boarding houses where workers packed in tight during America's urban boom, the boarding house special became legendary. These weren't just meals, they were daily miracles that kept the Industrial Revolution running. The boarding house cooks mastered something special with ground beef. They'd mix it with day-old bread soaked in milk. But here's the clever part. They'd add a spoonful of coffee from breakfast. That bitter edge cut through the richness and gave the meat a deeper flavor. Every boarding house had its own spice blend, kept in a tin above the stove, passed down when a new cook took over. Those kitchens ran like clockwork. The meat would stretch to feed 20 people, yet somehow taste like it was made for royalty. The secret? Layers. They'd put down a base of potatoes, add the seasoned beef, then pour on a gravy made from the morning's coffee and whatever vegetables were on hand. When times got tough, they'd add more potatoes, but that coffee gravy made sure nobody noticed the meat getting scarcer. Now those school cafeteria ladies of the 1950s, they were feeding an army of growing kids with their beef and beans school lunch. Before nutritional calculators, they had something better. Years of experience and recipes tested on thousands of hungry students. Beef and beans school lunch. The magic started at dawn. They'd mix ground beef with navy beans that had soaked overnight, adding their secret weapon, a splash of pickle juice from those huge cafeteria pickle jars. This wasn't just about stretching the beef. Those beans soaked up all the flavors, making every spoonful taste rich and satisfying. These cafeteria queens had timing down to a science. They knew exactly how long to simmer the mixture so the beans would hold their shape but still melt in your mouth. The seasonings were measured in coffee cans and pickle jars, a pickle jar of salt, half a coffee can of pepper. Nothing fancy, but it worked every single time. Some say you could set your watch by when they'd start adding the final seasonings, exactly 47 minutes before the first lunch bell. When harvest time rolled around on America's farms, something magical happened in those farmhouse kitchens, the harvest time hot dish. Farm wives knew timing was everything. They'd start with ground beef from their own cattle, mixing in whatever vegetables were ready in the garden. The trick was in the layering. Potatoes on the bottom to soak up all the flavors, then the seasoned beef, then layers of corn, green beans and tomatoes, fresh from the garden. But the real secret? They'd add a layer of cream-style corn right in the middle. During baking, it would create a rich sauce that brought everything together. Each farm kitchen had its own twist, usually based on what grew best in their soil. Up in Minnesota, they might add wild rice. Down in Iowa, it was all about the sweet corn. These hot dishes didn't just feed the harvest crews, they showcased each farm's best produce, a point of pride when neighbors came together to bring in the crops. While farm kitchens were perfecting their harvest dishes, city cooks were discovering their own innovations. corner store curry beef. Those little corner stores in America's growing cities became unexpected melting pots of flavor, and nothing shows this better than corner store curry beef. Picture small grocery stores run by families who brought their cooking wisdom across oceans, transforming simple ground beef into something extraordinary. Indian and Pakistani store owners introduced their customers to spices that most Americans had never tasted. They'd grind their own curry blends, coriander, cumin, and turmeric. But here's what made it special. They adapted these ancient recipes for American palates and ingredients. That ground beef would simmer with onions, garlic, and their secret spice blends until the whole neighborhood knew what was cooking. The magic happened when they taught their regular customers how to make it at home. They'd carefully measure out spices into little paper bags, writing cooking instructions by hand. Some store owners even kept special blends for different families. Mrs. Anderson likes it mild, or extra cardamom for the Johnsons. It was more than just selling groceries. It was sharing culture, one recipe at a time. Deep in America's mining towns, necessity created something uniquely delicious. Mining town meat pockets. These weren't ordinary hand pies. They were built to fuel men working deep underground. Mining town meat pockets. Miners' wives discovered that wrapping seasoned ground beef in a sturdy dough wasn't just convenient. It was essential. The crust had to be tough enough to survive being stuffed into lunch pails, yet tender enough to eat without utensils. They'd mix rye flour into the dough. It made the crust stronger and added a flavor that became the signature of mining town cooking. The filling told stories of where these families came from. Polish miners' wives added sauerkraut to the beef. Welsh families included turnips, and Italian households mixed in peppers and oregano. But they all shared one feature, a thick, crimped edge that acted as a handle, keeping coal-dusted hands away from the main part of the meal. Out on the prairie, where one-room schoolhouses dotted the landscape, the Prairie school teacher's casserole became a symbol of community care. Teaching wasn't just about books. It was about surviving those harsh prairie winters. Prairie school teacher's casserole. These young teachers, often living miles from home, learned to cook from their students' mothers. Each family would send in a little ground beef, some potatoes, or whatever vegetables they could spare. The teacher would combine these offerings into a casserole that could stretch to feed everyone during noon break. The dish evolved with the seasons. In autumn, it featured fresh corn and tomatoes. Winter versions used root vegetables stored in the school's cellar. But the real art was in the topping, a mixture of cornmeal and crushed crackers that turned golden and crispy in the schoolhouse's wood-burning stove. Some teachers became so famous for their casseroles that their recipes were copied into family cookbooks, preserved alongside multiplication tables and grammar rules. As school bells rang across the prairie, another American classic was taking shape in bustling boarding houses. Beef and biscuit boarding house stack. In those bustling boarding houses of growing cities, where time was money and hungry workers couldn't wait, the beef and biscuit boarding house stack became the talk of the town. This wasn't just another quick meal. It was an engineering marvel of layers and flavors. The genius started with the biscuits. Boarding house cooks would roll their dough paper thin, creating layers as delicate as fine silk. Between each biscuit went seasoned ground beef, but not just any beef mixture. They'd cook it with finely diced onions and a splash of coffee from the morning pot, a trick that made the meat taste richer than it had any right to be. The real mastery showed in the assembly. They'd stack these layers 6, sometimes 7 high, each level getting a ladle of gravy that would seep into those thin biscuits. The bottom biscuits soaked up all the flavors, becoming almost pudding-like, while the top stayed crispy enough to hear it crack when your fork hit it. Some boarding houses became so famous for their stacks that businessmen would fight over rooms just to get a regular seat at the table. Now, those general stores that dotted small-town America, they weren't just selling goods, they were cooking up community traditions with their general store beef supper. Every Saturday night, the back room would transform into the heart of town life. General store beef supper. Store owners knew every family's taste. They'd start with ground beef from local farms, mixing it with rice that had been sitting on their shelves. But here's the clever part. They'd add a spoonful of their pickled vegetables, chopped fine and mixed right in, and those pickled juices would work their way through the meat, creating flavors that nobody could quite figure out. The mixing method was something special, passed down through generations of store owners. They'd combine everything in huge crocks, letting it sit for hours while they tended the store. The warmth from the pot-bellied stove would slowly heat the mixture, drawing out flavors from every ingredient. By closing time, when families started gathering, that beef supper had turned into something magical. Out in the farm fields, where work started before dawn and ended long after dusk, the farmhand's favorite kept America's agricultural engine running. This wasn't just filling, it was fuel for the hardest working folks in the country. Farmhand's favorite. Farm wives knew exactly how to build this dish. They'd start with ground beef from their own cattle, mixing it with day-old bread soaked in fresh cream. The secret ingredient, eggs gathered that morning, beaten until frothy and folded into the meat mixture. Those eggs would puff up during cooking, making the dish feel lighter while still sticking to your ribs. The cooking process was an art form all its own. They'd press the mixture into cast-iron skillets that had been seasoned by decades of use. Each farm kitchen had its own rhythm. Some would cook it slow and low on the back of the wood stove. Others would give it a quick sear and finish it in the oven. But they all shared one crucial step, basting the top with butter and black coffee, creating a crust that sealed in all the juices. While farmhands were fueling up for their long days in the fields, church basements were buzzing with their own culinary traditions. Sunday social beef squares. Sunday afternoons after church brought something special to American tables. Sunday social beef squares. These weren't just casseroles, they turned fellowship halls into showcases of culinary pride. Church ladies had perfected a technique that modern cooks have forgotten. They'd press seasoned ground beef into special square pans, scoring the top in a diamond pattern that wasn't just decorative, it caught the savory sauce in tiny pools. Each serving came out identical, a skill born from years of making sure nobody at the social got a bigger piece than their neighbor. The presentation was pure artistry. They'd arrange these squares on huge platters, alternating them with colorful rows of pickled vegetables from summer gardens. But the real secret lay in the sauce. Each cook had her own version, but the base always started the same way. Pan drippings mixed with coffee from the church kitchen percolator, simmered until it was thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. These Sunday socials weren't just about feeding bodies, they fed community spirit. Young brides learned the technique by watching over shoulders, catching whispered tips about just how fine to dice the onions or exactly how many times to score the meat. Some say you could tell which family brought the dish just by looking at the pattern on top. When World War II changed everything, American kitchens answered the call to duty with the Victory Kitchen Surprise. This wasn't just cooking, it was patriotic ingenuity at its finest. Victory Kitchen Surprise. Home cooks became military strategists of the kitchen front. They'd take their ground beef and stretch it with oatmeal, not breadcrumbs because bread was too precious. But here's where it got clever. They'd soak that oatmeal in tomato juice from their victory gardens, making it disappear into the meat while adding rich flavor. The real victory was in the substitutions. When onions were scarce, they'd use dried onion skins saved from previous meals, soaked and minced fine. Garlic might be replaced with wild ramps gathered from the woods. Every ingredient had a strategic backup plan. Some cooks even dried and ground celery leaves to use as seasoning when traditional spices were hard to find. These wartime cooks had a saying, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. But they didn't just make do, they created dishes so good that families kept making them long after rationing ended. Each Victory Kitchen Surprise carried the story of American resourcefulness, turning scarcity into a celebration of flavor. These forgotten recipes aren't just about ground beef, they're about American ingenuity. From church basements to factory floors, each dish tells a story of making something special from simple ingredients. With a few modern tweaks, they're perfect for today's families looking to create their own traditions. Every time we cook one of these recipes, we're keeping a piece of history alive. Which of these forgotten treasures will you bring back to your family table? If you've enjoyed this journey through America's kitchen history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Share your own family recipes in the comments below, because every recipe saved is a story preserved.